I'm gonna just take the it's oh
But
no.
Charlie
No,
said not
Charlie
live
just
yet.
texted not live yet. But he could be saying that just to throw us off.
Yeah,
Can't be trusted.
now live.
Now live. So what do you think that means?
I don't know.
I don't want to make assumptions here.
I think it's
So
just. I
hi.
think it's just the two of us.
um, hello, Giles. Good evening to you.
It's good evening.
Afternoon. Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Yeah,
You're in
6 o'clock.
Milan on your way back from Afghanistan to London. How
Yep.
long will you be in Milan?
So I have to quarantine here in a hotel for a couple of weeks, and then back to London.
They won't let you back into London until you've quarantined elsewhere in Europe, or you're just trying to have a.
It, no, it's kind of like if I go back to London, I have to quarantine in a hotel of their choice. So it's not the and you're kind of locked in your room. At least by doing it in Italy, I had a bit more choice, and so and I get to eat more pasta.
Uh-huh. Right, right, naturally.
So it's a pasta
Um,
step off on the way home.
2 weeks of carb loading is what you're
Exactly.
really doing. Yeah. So you were in uh, Kabul and elsewhere in Afghanistan just now.
I was just actually in Kabul. The plan had been to go to Lashkar, but if anyone's been watching the news, you'll see that that city's almost been taken. There's a lot of heavy fighting there at the moment, so I wasn't able to get there. So yeah, I was based just in Kabul. It was as I say, if anyone's obviously watching the news, you'll be very aware of the increased fighting across the country at the moment. So it's a very tense situation. But Kabul itself is relatively calm. We heard a couple of car bombings while we were there, but generally it's not as bad as the rest of the country. But there's a great sense of trepidation, I guess, in people. Um, there's this kind of amazing young, hip, kind of cool side to Kabul that wasn't there when I first went there many years ago. And a lot of these people are living. They go to cafes, they use Instagram, a very sort of young, vibrant generation, and they are terrified of the return of the Taliban and what that will mean to this kind of burgeoning young middle class, like creatives, artists, a lot of people there. So it's a very tense situation.
Does that feel inevitable right now?
No,
That the
and I think
Taliban will fill that vacuum?
no, and I think maybe it's worth just clarifying because I'm sure for a lot of people, I'm somebody that's worked around Afghanistan for a long time, and I have very little understanding of it. It's a very complicated country, very complicated situation. So it might help just though to explain a little bit because as I say, I think if you watch the news, it would seem that the Taliban is just taking over the whole country and the collapse of the government is inevitable. I should explain that the south of the country has always been the Taliban strong point, and they speak the same language there. It's very much their ethnic group, the Talib. That is their homeland, you could say. The north has a different language, different kind of culturally, and the Taliban definitely it will be a very big different challenge for them to take over that part. And also, what they've been doing is mainly taking the countryside. So they've been taking the sort of vast swathes of the area that are not run by the government, that have always been slightly under Taliban rule anyway. So the news obviously is very worrying, and there is a very strong possibility that in time they will take the rest of the country, but I don't think it will happen as fast as people assume. The Taliban at the moment is working towards taking the border crossings so that any imports, any goods coming into the country will have to go through Taliban control, which means they bring income. It also puts pressure on the government. And I think what most people feel they're trying to do is get themselves in a bargaining position to be maybe a joint government or to push out the current government and be involved in that way. So it is very worrying. They're very strong. They are taking over big parts of the country, but I wouldn't assume that they will take over the whole of the country, in the immediate future.
Um, well, thanks for that framework. Maybe we could talk a little bit about your personal experience there in Afghanistan because I think it's really relevant to the story we're telling, and also just relatable. Like you are an example of the traumas and tragedies that can happen and are happening in Afghanistan.
Yes.
You went back. You've been back. Is this your second time back since
Yeah.
you're injured?
So just to put in context, because obviously, it's always great to be back with the Gish community. I know this is something that we do every year, but I know some people won't necessarily know about me and my work. But I'm a photographer that documents humanitarian stories, and it was 10 years ago. I was working in Afghanistan when I was injured by a landmine or improvised explosive device, and I lost both my legs and my arm. I was actually embedded with some troops from the US 101st Airborne. So it was obviously a hugely traumatic experience. I always say it was like the worst day at work you could ever imagine. I spent a year in hospital, lost both my legs, my arm, 37 operations. Very, very traumatic personally, very traumatic for my family. An incredibly hard year when many times it didn't look like I would survive. When I did get out of hospital, I had 6 months of kind of rehabilitation, learning to walk again. And then I decided the first place I wanted to go back to was Afghanistan. I decided that nobody was in a better position to tell the stories of injured Afghani than myself. It felt like a sort of sense of duty that I needed to go back. And so I went back to the hospital that we're dealing with at the moment, the emergency hospital, because I wanted to highlight through my story, the stories of injured civilians. And it was an incredible experience for me because obviously for years I had photographed people injured by war. Now I was photographing them from the viewpoint of somebody that had gone through the same experience. And I had a very, very deep moment when I was photographing a young boy there called Atola. And Atola was at the time, I think 7 years old. And he had lost one of his legs and his arm when he was walking to school. He'd stepped on a landmine. And so this was 9 years ago. And I remember this boy, and he was walking at this rehab center up and down. And I looked through my camera, and people would say to me, do you cry when you take photographs? Because people assume, obviously, I see so many traumatic things. And I would say, it's a bit like being a surgeon. When I'm working, I'm just focused on what I'm doing. This was the only time I've ever cried making a photograph, because I looked through my camera and I saw this 7-year-old boy, and he had this plastic arm, a plastic leg, and he was struggling to walk. And it just looked so wrong to see a young child, with these kind of prosthetic limbs. And he didn't even see me. I had my camera there, and he looked through me. And I had to walk away. And I remember thinking, why should a 7-year-old boy have to go through what I go through every day, physically, mentally, simply because he was walking to school? And that was the moment that I resolved that I was never going to be just a photographer. I was going to be something more and actually try and make a real impact in people's lives directly. And I would campaign, and I would do everything I could, because I thought if my life had one meaning, it would be that one less child had to go through what Atola goes through. And that became my life's purpose, which is where I guess that journey is what meant that we cross paths and are able to do the things that we do now. So that was 9 years ago. I came back from that trip. I've traveled to many other conflict zones, but didn't go back to Afghanistan again. Because obviously for me personally, the challenge of going back there psychologically is very difficult. I find it very nerve-wracking to be back there. And secondly, because of my family, it's very hard for them when I go back. So I've worked in Iraq, South Sudan, many other conflict zones, but not Afghanistan. But this year, I felt with a lot of stuff happening, with the Western forces pulling out, maybe less attention on Afghanistan, I felt it was time for me to return. So that's why I went back this time. It's 9 years. I can tell you I was pretty nervous sat on the plane. I'm not a very, people kind of obviously assume that the work I do, I'm kind of courageous and don't worry about these things. I'm a scaredy cat. I won't even go on a roller coaster. So, sitting on a plane back to Afghanistan, my heart was pumping and I felt physically sick. But
wow,
I knew I had to go back, and I knew that this was the project that we had to work on this year, because it's not just about helping these children. It's also about showing solidarity to the people of Afghanistan and saying that, with all the troubles and all the things that have gone on, that we stand with you still. And, I think it's one of the things that people as well mistake with me. They think I must be angry with people of Afghanistan or what happened there. And I've never seen that way. I was injured by hatred and by ignorance. And I've spent my whole life trying to correct those things through education and informing people and through love. And so the people of Afghanistan are close to my heart. And yeah, it's a real important project that we're doing this year. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm rambling.
No, no, you're, oh, yeah, yeah. Um, well, I mean, first of all, I just, my heart goes out to you. And, you say you're not courageous, but that's not actually true. The fact that you get scared and then move through it to do these things is pretty remarkable. Um, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't be scared in that situation, but
Well, come
um,
with me
I, okay, actually, let's do that.
then.
Um, I I think it's relevant also to talk a little bit about a more macro issue here, which is the fact that the U.S. is pulling its forces out of Afghanistan, which in recent years has been a little bit of a stabilizing force there, just because it's such a large military presence, which is evidenced by the fact that the number of injuries and fatalities has skyrocketed this year as those troops start to pull out and the US's involvement there is pulling out. And I'm not saying that the US's influence in Afghanistan has been a net positive. Afghanistan was a place where we fought wars of extension with the Soviets going back for the last 40 years. And the fact of the matter is, there's tremendous amounts of bombs and weapons, guns that are in Afghanistan that were furnished to the Afghan people by the U.S. or the Russians over the years. So everyone is armed to the teeth, which makes the casualties greater and the loss of life higher. So our legacy there is, and now as we're pulling out, I think that we as Westerners have a responsibility to the people of Afghanistan because we have been complicit in creating the situation there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Afghanistan is a victim of geography. It's this relatively small country that lies on the borders of Russia, of Pakistan, of Iran, of China. All these really strong regional powers that have been using Afghanistan for their proxy wars. And this goes back hundreds of years. I mean, the British Empire was trying to push up through Afghanistan, and then the Russians, and then the US, Western forces there. And, really most of the conflicts that have happened in Afghanistan have very little to do with the people of Afghanistan. They are to do with, the Americans and the Russians, to do with, extremist groups in America, to do with the British Empire and colonization of India, all these different things. And Afghanistan has been the victim of all these conflicts. And as I say, it has all these regional powers that are still to this day vying for influence through Afghanistan. So Afghanistan has been a country that most people have only ever known war. And you speak to generations, and the fathers have been injured, the grandfathers have been injured, the children have been injured. You will hardly meet anybody that hasn't been impacted by war there. And it's a country that lives on a very basic level. There's very little industry, there's very little income from any other sources. That they struggle generally, and yet it's a country awash with modern weapons. And that's the sad reality, is that however you look at the rights and wrongs of war, the reality is Afghanistan has been flooded by other powers putting money and weapons into that country to fight their proxy wars. And this is not playing the blame game on anybody. This is just a simple fact. And it's been left after this recent conflict as a very unstable country with, again, regional powers again vying for influence and vying for power. The reality is most people fighting these conflicts come from very basic rural areas. The money and the weapons come from somewhere else. And that's the sad reality. And again, no matter how you look at what's happened over the last 20 years with the US and Western forces being there, we have definitely left it as a very unstable country. I think it's something ridiculous, like $3 trillion have been spent fighting the war, and yet there's still very few. I mean, that figure works out, I think, I'm sure there's somebody smarter than me can do this, but I think the maths works out at £30 million a day it costs to fight that war for 20 years. And yet there's hardly any schools, there's hardly any hospitals, so you have to sort of question this use of money.
Can you imagine the good that could have been done if that had been spent on building infrastructure and schools and health and welfare?
But that's what I see.
Such a tragic.
That's what I see in every war zone I go to. You know, you see the money spent on weapons, and you just think, gosh, if this money could be used to build education and healthcare, you know, the difference these countries make. You know, it's a sad reality. You know, I mean, in the UK alone, when you know, the COVID epidemic started, there was a sort of outcry of there wasn't enough facilities, there wasn't enough respirators, ventilators, all these different bits of equipment, and the shortages within the NHS. I have never been in a situation on a front line where the military fighting has said they've got a shortage of bombs. You know, they've never said, hey, we can't go bombing today because we can't afford it. You know, the average guided missile costs, I think, $20,000. You know, they drop those, you know, the Western forces all the time. So it's sad that we never seem to find a shortage of money to fight these wars, whereupon we do find a shortage for education and for healthcare, let alone, you know, these are in our own countries, let alone the countries that we are involved with. So, you know, I don't want to preach. And as I say, I'm not talking about the rights and wrongs of war, but I do think that if we invested in education and in healthcare as opposed to bombing, you know, in 25 years of covering conflicts, I'm yet to see a solution solved by bombing.
Well, what we're trying to do with this project here today is, I guess, ameliorate in a small way the legacy of war, if you'll pardon my co-opting that expression. Um, there are so many children who are who are still stepping on improvised explosives or being shot in Afghanistan and Kabul, and you have been documenting their stories at a children's ward. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're doing a fundraiser for those of you who don't know? We've raised in the last 20 less than 24 hours. We've in the last 18 hours we've raised $70,000. And if we raise $100,000, we will fully fund this. What will that $100,000 fund specifically?
So let me sort of take it a step back to your first point. Obviously, we've just been talking about kind of global politics and war, and it's quite overwhelming for people to hear. I think, you know, the realities of conflict. Let's go back to the people of Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan are incredible. You know, they're resilient, they're strong, they're resourceful, they're hardworking, they're incredibly generous. You know, and whenever I go back to Afghanistan, I'm greeted with sort of open arms and hugs, and we sit and eat. And you know, the biggest problem I have there is the amount of tea I drink, that I need a toilet the whole time, because people are just constantly stopping you to have a cup of tea with you, to chat, to show their kindness. And you know, I think we should focus on that and say that, you know, yes, all these things have happened to the country, but the people themselves are just really wonderful. And the children that have been injured, you know, they couldn't be more innocent. You know, some of them are 3, 4, 5 years old that have lost limbs, and yet the place is still so incredibly uplifting. You know, even in that ward, you don't see many of the children crying. They're very, very, very stoic people, and reality is, though, there isn't the support for them to be able to get full recovery and to be able to go back to normal life. So what we're, you know, aiming to do is to work alongside this Italian NGO called Emergency, who runs a hospital there, incredible organization that I've worked with for many years. Most of the staff in the hospital are Afghans themselves, which I think is very important to remind people of: the nurses, the doctors, the surgeons. You know, this is Afghans supporting their own children. And what we're going to try and do is to support that children's ward, because they're constantly trying to find ways to fund it, to keep it going. You know, the great risk is that it closes. What we want to do is to raise the funds so we can guarantee at least for 6 months, maybe longer, and to say that that ward will stay open. I mean, they're dealing with between 800 and 1,000 casualties, children, through that ward every year. And those children all are injured by conflict. So they have injuries from bombs, from shells, from explosive devices, from grenades, you name it. But that is how they're injured. So if you imagine, we potentially, if we can raise that money for the first 6 months, we'll be supporting 400 children under the age of 16, most of them under the age of 14, and helping them to rebuild their lives, but also to know that the people from outside of their country are still thinking of them and there to support them and help them to regain that future. So, we'll be, let's say, keeping the ward going. That means having all the nurses working there, the surgeries where they're recovering. We're also going to try and make sure that each one of them gets, and it may sound like a small thing in the context, but a nice little cuddly toy, something, to remind them of home. Because I should point out, it's particularly hard for them because most of the children, in fact, all of them at the moment, because of COVID, can't have parents visiting. So, if you imagine 5, 6, 7-year-old children with life-changing injuries lying in a hospital bed on their own, you can't even think how traumatic that is.
Oh, God, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the
I
nurses incredible. But
my daughter is starting a week-long summer camp. She's 8 next week, and she can't stand the thought of going to camp by herself on the
yeah,
first day, let alone being in a hospital and dealing with getting, a surgery on your amputated leg.
well, exactly. And many of these children come from rural areas. They're suddenly, they're in a rural area. They're with their family. A bomb goes off. I mean, one of the girls we met there, her whole family had been killed. She was just 7 years old herself. Woke up from
Oh,
the explosion in a hospital bed on her own. Now, the shock of that is hard to, for an adult would be traumatic. For a child to be in that situation is beyond that. The nurses are incredible, but they're busy. I mean, they're nurses. They're running around trying to do all the healthcare for people. So anything we can do to just help the morale as well is what we're going to be doing. So, small gifts, little things that just give, because I saw it, I went with this amazing photographer called Emma Francis, who was working with me. And we took over some like coloring books and some few toys, and to see how even that little gift really brought a bit of light to those children. And the fact that we'll be able to do a lot more of that, I think is really important, as well as obviously the more important stuff of actually keeping that ward running.
well, I'm so grateful to you, Giles, for bringing these stories to us and helping make these connections so that the Gish community can do these projects with you and have a real impact in the world. It is so meaningful, and I'm just so grateful for you. So thank you.
Well, I mean, as you know, I sent you a text message, a couple of weeks ago, just to say that, the work I do can be very difficult and challenging. I see in many ways the worst in humanity. I see the worst that man can do to people. And I say man because it generally is men doing these things. And every year to be involved with Gish, to be involved with you and the whole community, to see that it kind of negates so much of that negative stuff I see in the world. And it's a reminder that when people come together to do good, we can create real change. And it lifts my heart every year and gives me the strength to carry on for the next 12 months. So really, thank you to everyone.
Thank you. So everyone watching, please make a contribution. We're now over 70% of our $100,000 goal. That $100,000 will take us through to the end of 2021, but this children's ward will need to continue operating beyond 2021. So if we can exceed our goal and help these doctors and nurses care for injured children into 2022, please make a contribution and get your friends and your families to make a little contribution too.
Yeah,
Thank you all. And thank you, Giles.
it really is just to say as well that, I'll be sending updates. I'll make sure the hospital sends updates over the next year of these children. And it really is just like whatever that gift is, whatever we're able to each donate to make this difference. It's two things. It's actually helping to save the lives of children. And it's also saying, to the world that all these things go on, but that we can overcome and that we can show that love to people.
Well, love you, Giles. I hope you have a good pasta quarantine in
Yeah,
Milan on,
Pasta Fest
on
is
your.
beginning.
I don't know if everyone caught. I think we were maybe chatting before we signed off, but Giles is quarantining in Milan on his way back from Afghanistan, and so he's carb loading right now. Um, Thank you all, and please click the link and make a donation. Thank you so much. Bye, Giles.
Bye, everyone. Bye.